Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we'll continue our reading of The American Slave Coast. We're on chapter 31, which starts on page 425, and it's titled Swallowed by Millions. And it starts with two quotes. One from William Lloyd Garrison, written in The Liberator, October 5th, 1833, who said, "I do believe that Virginia is become another Guinea, and the eastern shore an African coast." And the other quote is by Frederick Douglass, saying, "I have known what it is to be dragged 15 miles to the human flesh market and to be sold like a brute beast. I am from a slave breeding state where slaves are reared for the market as horses, sheep, and swine are. Already the dominant commercial American city, New York took a major step toward consolidating its supremacy at the beginning of 1818 when packet boats began running monthly between New York and Liverpool. Packets left at a scheduled departure time, whether they were full of cargo or not, making shipping more predictable. And they had to do it in all kinds of weather, fighting their way across from Liverpool to New York, even if it was stormy and icy, especially in winter. The westbound or uphill trip from England to America, going against the Gulf Stream, was the most dangerous passage a sailor could make anywhere in the world. Because vessels couldn't sail directly against the prevailing westerly winds, they had to tack or set their sails at 45-degree angles to the wind in a series of successive adjustments that allow the craft to make an arc in the windward direction. Accordingly, they traveled farther than they would have and much slower than if the winds had been in their favor. Sailing ships from New England to America typically could expect to travel anywhere from 400 to 700 miles more than when they were going the other way. The Gulf Stream was also an obstacle from the American coasting trading southward down around Florida to New Orleans. North Carolina was a navigational menace with sandbars outlining its shores. Capes Hatteras, Lookout, and Fear all posed dangers for passing vessels. But it was also where the vessels began to have to go against the Gulf Stream. Then, going around Florida, there were coral reefs, shoals, keys, sandbars, eddy currents, and shallow water, to say nothing of the difficulty of passing through the Straits of Florida against the force of the current. Maritime insurers rated the accident rate from New York to New Orleans about 1.25 to 1.5%, more dangerous than the trip from New York to Liverpool, though not more dangerous than the trip from Liverpool to New York. New York's monopolization of the carrying trade was bitterly resented by the cotton growers of the South, but there was nothing they could do. Even from Charleston, the Great Circle northern route was the shortest way from America to England. Though wealthy planters were beyond conspicuous consumers, there were so few of them that the South, that the South didn't buy enough imports to make regular direct round trip transatlantic shipping from Liverpool to Charleston worthwhile. Ships would have arrived in America with their holds full of ballast. The shipping profit from sending cotton out and receiving imported goods in return went to New York, where the products were handled. Coasting packets took from Carolina to Georgia cotton to New York, where it was loaded into transatlantic packets. When ships arrived at New York carrying merchandise from Britain, the part of it was destined for the Low Country traveled on a coasting packet, so British coasts cost more in South Carolina than they did in New York. And needless to say, when specie was shipped from Britain to pay for purchases, it came to New York. Baltimore had the best harbor in the Chesapeake and some of the best shipping facilities in the country, but it had no chance of competing with New York for European commerce. Instead, it was perfectly positioned to specialize in servicing the expanding domestic market, and it grew with the Republic. Its shipyards built the lightweight, high speed schooners that began darting back and forth along the coast as packets, bringing regular news from one place to another. The run was especially profitable between Baltimore and New Orleans, since both cities were rich emporia. Ships could go full in both directions. Maryland, a border state with diversified agriculture that counted a number of Quakers in its population, was increasingly divided over slavery. On the eastern shore, there was much slave agriculture, but also anti slavery sentiment. In the northern part of the state, especially, slavery was on the decline after 1820, as it was in Delaware. They would like us to believe that these Quakers were fighting adamantly against it. It just wasn't profitable for Quakers to have slaves. Limited terms of service were becoming increasingly more common for Maryland slaves, raising them almost to the category of indentured servants. Slave sale advertisements naming individuals generally specified whether they had a term of service or were slaves for life. Fast rising Baltimore had slave labor, but it was not a slave society the way Richmond or Charleston was. Seth Rockman describes the diverse mix of early 19th century Baltimore workforce as a continuum of slaves for life to transient day laborers, with term slaves, rented slaves, self hiring slaves, indentured servants, redemptioners, apprentices, prisoners, children, and paupers occupying the spaces in between. Greetings, Anthony McPhail. I'm so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. He argues that the reason slavery remained a viable dynamic in Baltimore labor market was the enslaved labor's capitalized value. The perpetuation of slavery in a place like Baltimore owed less to the actual labor compelled from slave workers and more to the fact that plantation purchasers in Charleston, Augusta, and New Orleans, and throughout the South, were willing to pay hundreds of dollars for Baltimore slaves. One of those enslaved laborers in Baltimore was Frederick Douglass, who ultimately escaped on a boat leaving the port. Though he remembered what that going to live in Baltimore laid the foundation and open gateway to all his subsequent prosperity. While working as a hired slave at the Fell Points shipyard, he was beaten by four of the white apprentices in a fight in which his left eye was nearly knocked out. And he was horribly mangled in other respects. He described the relations between classes of laborers there, saying, "The white laboring man was robbed by the slave system of the just results of his labor because he was flung into competition with a class of laborers who worked without wages. The slaveholders blinded them to this competition by keeping alive their prejudice against the slaves as men, not against them as slaves. They appealed to their pride, often denouncing emancipation as tending to place the white working man on an equality with Negroes. And by this means, they succeeded in drawing off the minds of the poor whites from the real fact that by which the slave master they were already regarded as but a single remove from equality with the slave. The impression was cunningly made that slavery was the only power that could prevent the laboring white man from falling to the level of the slave's poverty and degradation. To make this enmity deep and broad between the slave and the poor white man, the latter, the poor white man, was allowed to abuse and whip the slave without hindrance. These poor white mechanics in Mr. Gerinder's garage shipyard, instead of applying the natural, honest remedy for the apprehended evil and objecting at once to the work, they were thereby the side of the slaves, made a cowardly attack upon the free colored mechanics. The feeling was about this time very bitter toward colored people in Baltimore, and they, free and slave, suffered all manner of insult and wrong. What he's saying is that if you can convince the lowest white man that he's better than a Negro, then that lowest white man will look down on the Negro and not notice the white slave owners, the white employers, the white wealthier class, the white employer class picking their pockets and taking away their human dignity. That's what he's saying. The Baltimore waterfront was a key site for slave trading. There were 24 wharfs along the harbor, to any one of which Maryland captains of local packet boats coming from Easton, Chestertown, Kent Island, or other eastern shore points of origin might bring along a slave or two to sell. Most were sold without newspaper ads, but some surviving examples testify to this practice. Like this article here that says, "A valuable servant for sale, a very handsome, healthy mulatto boy of general good character, 19 years of age and has 17 years to serve. He has been accustomed to farm work and the management of horses. He would make an excellent coachman or waiter. He is the property of an insolvent debtor and must be sold. Inquire on the board of Easton Packet by the Bowley's Wharf." So what they're saying is that they had a half breed here available to sell who was 19 and was due to be in service until he was almost 40. And that for those 17 years, he was basically an indentured servant, not a slave, because he was not a slave for life. And this was indicative of the type of slave ad you could see in the newspapers during that time. Baltimore American and Commercial Daily Advertiser of December 21st, 1818. This nameless mulatto was sold in payment of a debt. He might have remained in Baltimore, but perhaps hired out by a shipyard by his new owner, or perhaps ultimately taken down south. In the latter case, it is doubtful that his freedom date 17 years later would have meant much if he had been taken south. It is clear that there was already an export market for slaves out of Maryland by this time, though not much direct documentation survives. An 1816 grand jury report in Baltimore stated, "There are in this city houses appropriated to this trade as prisons for the reception of the Negroes intended to be carried to other states. Slaves are crowded together, male and female, in one common dungeon. They are loaded with irons, confined in their filth, and subject to various species of cruelty and tyranny from their keepers." That means that they were in their own filth. They were in the dung and the urine and the vomit that they spewed out. They were not kept in clean quarters. The earliest shipment of slaves by water from Baltimore to New Orleans, of which we have record, though clearly not the first to take place, was December 1818, when in Ralph Clayton's description, 24 slaves boarded by 6 different shippers were brought to the dock over a 4-day period to be put on the brig Temperance. In addition to slaves consigned from the traders on the hard sail south, the packers might take migrating farmers transporting their labor forces or passengers accompanied by enslaved personal servants. So they had all manner of people on these ships. Austin Woolfolk Jr. was only 19 years old when he began running his Cash for Negroes advertisements in the Baltimore press in 1816. Almost as soon as the coast was clear of the British, working with his father, he had built up a stake in his hometown of Augusta, Georgia, by supplying slaves to planters relocating to newly available Alabama land. There were no quantities of slaves available in Cotton Mad, Georgia, so he went northward in search of supply to the farmers of Maryland's eastern shore, whose eagerness to sell slaves had already been amply demonstrated. Woolfolk was not the first slave trader to offer cash in newspaper advertisements, but he became emblematic of the practice. Spending liberally on advertising, traders helped anchor the Upper South's newspaper industry, running ads in every issue, all season long, of every small town paper in their regions of coverage. Most merchants handled a variety of merchandise, but Woolfolk, who embraced as part of his pitch the term Georgia man, dealt only in slaves, and unlike other slave traders, he did not run coffles. He only shipped captives by water. To maximize profits, a slave trader had to cover both ends of the transaction, buy young people cheaply from the farmers in Georgia and Maryland, transport them to the deep South, and sell them there at premium prices. That was their whole scheme. Woolfolk could bypass intermediaries by canvassing farms directly, offering farmers more for young African Americans than the Richmond bound traders would. That meant having operations at both ends with all the complexities of interstate law, taxation, and banking, all the complications of transport, and a large network of contacts. It meant a cash flow intensive business that had to respond quickly to changing political, economic, or weather conditions. And it entailed having offices and slave processing facilities in different cities with partners or agents in those cities. In Woolfolk's case, as with many merchants, his family provided them. The Woolfolks developed the most effective network of canvassing the farms of the Eastern Shore for slaves to buy, establishing a base of operations headed by Woolfolk's brother Joseph at Easton. Once the harvest was in and the farmers were ready to sell, Woolfolk's agents would scour the area, visiting every farm they could. Throughout the region, they established temporary headquarters at one or another inn. They distributed handbills and took out cash for Negroes' newspaper ads. They sailed the captives downriver to the Chesapeake Bay and on to Baltimore, where they were held in Woolfolk's jail until he had a full gang for shipment. Woolfolk generally consummated just a few sales at a time when buying in Maryland, writes William Calderhead, and from 1 to 4 slaves per purchase. Most chattels were in their teens, and males outnumbered females by a ratio of 8 to 5. Slaves were not purchased in families, but on occasion, a mother and child would be acquired as a unit, but only on occasion. Like everyone else in his trade, Woolfolk routinely separated families. John Thompson, born in Maryland in 1812 on a plantation with about 200 slaves, had as one of his earliest childhood memories a visit to the jail where his sister was about to be sold as his mother wept. And he said, "The first thing that saluted my ears was the rattling of the chains upon the limbs of the poor victims. It seemed to me to be a hell upon earth, emblematical of that dreadful dungeon where the wicked are kept until the day of God's retribution, and where their torment ascends up forever and ever. As soon as my sister saw our mother, she ran to her and fell upon her neck, but was unable to speak a word. There was a scene which angels witnessed. There were tears which I believe were bottled and placed in God's depository. There were to be reserved until the day in which he shall pour out his wrath upon this guilty nation." The slave buyers chatted up the locals to find out who might be going out of business, who needed cash, who might have an extra laborer to sell. It was much like that what the horse traders did, and not a few people who wound up doing this kind of work whose horse traders who had moved over into trading slaves. Their successors would move back to selling horses again after emancipation. The working vocabulary of the slave trade overlapped that of the livestock business as per the use of the term like stock, specifically a breeding term to describe a labor force. So that's how they described us, as stock: Maryland stock, Virginia stock, New York stock, South Carolina stock, Georgia stock. Greetings, forecast. I'm so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. We're on page 430 of The American Slave Coast. The title of this chapter is called Swallowed by Millions. It was much like what the horse traders did, And not a few people who wound up doing this kind of work were former horse traders who had moved over into trading slaves. Their successors would go back to selling slaves after emancipation. The working vocabulary of the slave trade overlapped that of the livestock business as per the use of the term like stock, specifically a breeding term to describe a labor force. A slave dealers advertised themselves as Negro traders, but most were identified more generically as brokers, commission merchants, auctioneers, etc. So they would always find some fancy title to give to these slave traders. The network of the slave trade was not limited to the traders' own agents. The commerce spread in largesse around Maryland and especially around Baltimore through an informally organized network whose meeting places were inns and taverns, some of which were especially known for their involvement in the business. Bartenders were often used as agents, writes Ralph Clayton. Their exposure to numerous travelers placed them in an ideal position to act as go betweens. A number of ads often reflected the seller or buyer's desire to have an information left at the bar. Clayton has compiled a list of Baltimore spots where traders did business. Places like Mr. Lily's Tavern, Fowler's Tavern, Fountain Inn, Center's Tavern, Mrs. Kirk's, the General Wayne Inn, William Fowler's, John Kugel's, the Columbian Hotel, the Globe Hotel, etc. This pattern was consistent throughout the South, where hotels commonly had secure lockup rooms that ranged from individual cells to full fledged jails. You hear this mess? They had jails under bars and in hotels. Slave jailing was an informally organized, widely distributed system of for profit prisons. Traders in many towns maintained their own jails while passing coffle drivers could use them, with the advantage of possibly being able to sell or buy through contracts there. In other towns, the local lawman might be happy to rent the space in the town jail for the night. Speaking of the 1850s, Bancroft wrote, every southern city and some mere villages had slave jails, slave pens, or slave yards, as they were variously called. They differed much in size and character. Some were carefully built, while others were old buildings, houses, stables, or sheds, slightly altered. They usually had some of the characteristics of a poor barrack, a boarding stable, and a prison. At the best of the public ones, where slaves were fed and watched for any stranger, the usual charge was 25 or 30 cents a day, hardly as much as the feeding and care of a horse at any public stable. And their food was almost as plain as a horse's. And they often had less that could be called a bed. They slept on the hard floor and considered themselves fortunate if, in addition to their bundle of clothes, which they used for a pillow, they could get an old blanket. Local sheriffs were good contacts for Woolfolk's agents because they were in a position to flip runaways whose disgusted owners might authorize handing them over to Woolfolk in exchange for a cash settlement, or who might be sold unclaimed. Surviving records from Baltimore show 15 handovers of runaways to him from 1829 to 1836. Liz on August 10th, 1835, Kitty on November 5th, 1835, Henry Hazleton on December 3rd, 1835, etc. Some runaways might really be free people kidnapped off the street, as in the case of Fortune Lewis, who was abducted in 1822, taken to Woolfolk's jail and sent to Washington, where he was able to prove his freedom and was released. But such a happy resolution for the victim was unusual. The free Black people of Baltimore, and indeed free Black people throughout the North, lived with the knowledge that they could be kidnapped and sold at any time. Austin Woolfolk's early growth was slowed by national economic difficulties. Much as the First Bank of the United States had previously done in 1792, the Second Bank of the United States caused a panic soon after it was chartered. The Depression, remembered as the Panic of 1819, took 2 years to bottom out and 2 more years to come back, though its effects were lighter in the newly wealthy Deep South. Not till 1821 did Woolfolk ship more than 100 slaves south annually, writes Calderhead. That was the year he moved into his Pratt Street quarters, complete with his own slave jail. In the following year, his scale of operation doubled, and for the next 6 years, he shipped from 230 to 460 slaves south on an annual basis. Woolfolk's main source of supply was the farms of Maryland's Eastern Shore. Like those of Virginia, they were well fed, hard-working young farmhands who were established as a premium brand. Calderhead notes that for sellers, many who dealt with the traders once were inclined to do so again. For those repeat vendors, selling slaves had become a regular part of their economic cycle, like Thomas Jefferson wanted, where he talked about natural increase. So they were on a program of regular production and sale, which is to say, they had become slave farmers who sold perhaps one or two teenagers a year. Like many traders, Woolfolk lived on his jail site in a house that was a part of a complex where dozens of people might be chained up at a time. The size of Woolfolk's operation made him the public face of the Negro trader, and his name the terror of the enslaved. He had a kind of boogeyman status for enslaved children, except unlike the boogeyman, he was real. Frederick Douglass grew up in fear of Woolfolk, like many others who were born enslaved. Douglass had been separated from his mother at an early age and did not know the exact date of his birth, which he reckoned to have been in 1818. Before he was hired and sold away, Douglass was one of about 1,000 people Edward Lloyd owned on Maryland's Eastern Shore near Easton. That kind of estate took generations to accumulate. Lloyd was descended from 17th century Maryland old money, and the core of his property is still in the hands of his descendants to this very day. Lloyd was at various times a congressman, a senator, and governor of Maryland. It is ironic that he is most remembered for owning the plantation where Frederick Douglass was born and lived as a child. Lloyd's captives labored on a network of neighboring agricultural prisons administered from the central location. Douglass, who described the brutalities of Lloyd's regime, recalled of the central plantation that if a slave was convicted of any high misdemeanor, made and became unmanageable, or evinced a determination to run away, he was brought immediately here, severely whipped, put on a board the sloop carried to Baltimore, and sold to Austin Woolfolk or some other slave trader as a warning to the other slaves remaining. Woolfolk accounted for 53% of the 4,304 people documented and sent by ocean-going trade from Baltimore to New Orleans between 1819 and 1831. But despite his outsized historical footprint, there were many traders. A person with Negroes of either sex to dispose of might, for example, stop by the New Bridge Hotel and leave word for Kentucky trader David Anderson, who accounted for 223 of the 1,400 plus people known to have been shipped by water from Baltimore to New Orleans from 1818 to 1822. Woolfolk knew better than to parade the grim spectacle of loading his ships before the eyes of the town. When it was time to sail, the captives were marched under cover of pre dawn darkness out of his complex, located near present day Oriole Park, down 7 or so blocks to Fells Point. From there, they sailed around the peninsula of Florida, and many were ultimately sold out of the Woolfolk firm's New Orleans office at 122 Chartres Street. Others were taken to Natchez, where Woolfolk sold slaves as an advertisement in the Woodville, Mississippi Republican that ran for 3 months in late 1826 to early 1827, which announced Negroes for sale. The subscriber has on hand 75 likely young Virginia born Negroes of various descriptions. So, right there, he was saying that he had obedient slaves, which he offers to sell low for cash or good acceptance. Any person wishing to purchase would do well to call and suit themselves. I will have a constant supply through the season. I can be found at Purnell's Tavern, Natchez, December 1st, 1826, Austin Woolfolk. So, as you can see, he was saying that he had a steady supply of obedient slaves coming from Virginia going to the South, where he was selling people downriver. Frederick Douglass recalled, When when a child, I lived upon Philpott Street, Fells Point, Baltimore, and have watched some from the wharfs the slave ships in the basin anchored from the shore, with their cargoes of human flesh waiting for favorable winds to waft them down to the Chesapeake. There was at that time a grand slave mart kept at the head of Pratt Street by Austin Woolfolk. His agents were sent into every town and county in Maryland announcing their arrival through the papers and on flaming handbills headed Cash for Negroes. These men were generally well-dressed men and very captivating in their manners, ever ready to drink, to treat, and to gamble. The fate of many a slave has depended upon the turn of a single card, and many a child has been snatched from the arms of his mother by bargains arranged in a state of brutal drunkenness. The fleshmongers gather up their victims by dozens and drive them chained to the General Depot in Baltimore. When sufficient number, when a sufficient number have been collected here, a ship is chartered for the purpose of conveying the forlorn crew to Mobile or New Orleans. From the slave prison to the ship, they are usually driven in the darkness of night, for since the anti slavery agitation, a certain caution is observed. In the deep, still darkness of midnight, I have often been aroused by by the dead heavy footsteps of the piteous cries of the chained gangs that passed our door. The anguish of my boyish heart was intense, and I was often consoled when speaking to my mistress in the morning to hear her say that the custom was very wicked, that she hated to hear of the rattle of the chains and the heartrending cries. I was glad to find one who sympathized with me in my horror. So his mistress sympathized with him, but did she sympathize with him enough to let him go free and to let the others go free? A coastwise trip took 3 weeks or so, depending on the weather, versus the 7 or 8 weeks to make the grueling walk from Maryland to New Orleans. Excuse me. Economic historians Herman Freudenberger and Jonathan B. Pritchett found that 8 passages, shipments was the term, from Norfolk to New Orleans took an average of 19 days in transit at a cost of $17 per slave. But the transit time, they found, only 18% of the time elapsed between receiving a certificate of good conduct, which was affirming that the enslaved person in question was not dangerous, and the sale. The time of actual transport was sandwiched between weeks of being held in pens at either end. Though an individual interstate trader could be a process of between 2 and 3 months, there were cases that took a year, a process of mental agony for the captive. Enslaved women were frequently pregnant, and on occasion, women gave birth while in a holding pen or at sea. The advantages of a coastal speed over the overland trade route were obvious. Coastal trade turned capital around quicker, essential in a cash intensive business. Market conditions could be responded to more quickly. A minimum of 2 weeks' expenses of provisions were saved, and most important, the enslaved arrived in better condition, especially the children, who had a hard time keeping up with the coffel's pace, which meant a higher price. There were relatively few onboard fatalities among these young people who had, after all, been selected for their relative health and appeal. Long months of confinement in pens, followed by weeks at sea, facilitated the spread of diseases, but there were not these were not the Middle Passage crossings that averaged something like a 15% mortality rate en route. The inward shipping manifests show a disturbing phenomenon, one digit at a time. The number of children under 10 sold away from their mothers and sent for sale alone. Louisiana put a stop to that in 1829 with a unique law that harmonized with the rules of the old Code Noir, prohibiting the sale of children under 10 without their mother unless documented proof of orphanhood was furnished. This statute markedly lowered the number of sales in Louisiana of out of state unaccompanied young slave children, writes Judith K. Schaefer. Immediately before passage of this law, 13.5% of the slaves sent from Virginia to New Orleans were under the age of 10 years old. Immediately following the passage of this act, shipments of from Virginia of slave children under 10 declined to 3.7%, and none of these were unaccompanied by their mothers. Which is to say, in Austin Woolfolk's heyday, until a regulation of control to control it was implemented, almost 10% of the involuntary passengers shipped south were motherless children under the age of 10. For that matter, most of the rest of the passengers were little more than children in the early years of their reproductive lives. 93% of the enslaved people whose passage Freudenberger and Pritchett could document were between the ages of 11 and 30. But then it was a young country. Black or white, people didn't live all that long. Over 40% of Baltimore was aged 15 or younger in the 1820s. There were dangers connected with the ocean going ships, piracy, and mutiny. Both happened to ships carrying slaves for Woolfolk. The mutiny happened on April 20th, 1826, when the schooner named Decatur left for New Orleans with 31 enslaved people on board. When the veteran captain made the mistake of allowing a small groups of them on deck unchained, two men took him by surprise and threw him overboard. The mate, attempting to come to his aid, was also thrown overboard. The mutineers had hoped to escape to San Domingo, or Haiti, which since 1822 had taken over the entire island of La Española. But lacking the navigation skills, they instead floated aimlessly and were overtaken. Ultimately, 14 men of the Decatur were brought into New York, where incredibly they escaped into the city. Only one man, William Bowser, was apprehended, and he alone was tried for the murders of the captain and the mate. So, as you can see, there are often stories of slave mutiny, of mutiny by slaves, where we overtook ships and we demanded our freedom. And we knew the stories of Haiti at this time, and that was still in our institutional memory, but we didn't have the navigating skills to get there. Couples came via the National Road to Wheeling, Virginia. And let's talk about coffles for a moment. Coffles were these horrible chain gangs where you were chained end to end, hands and feet, to the person in front of you with less than 2 feet of space in between. Often you were naked and barefoot walking across this country. Anyway, couples came via the National Road to Wheeling, Virginia, all the time during coffle season, there to be sent down to the Ohio River, which empties into the Mississippi. Recalling his days as a 19-year-old saddler in Wheeling, Benjamin Lundy wrote, "My heart was deeply grieved at the gross abomination. I heard the wail of the captive. I felt his pang of distress, and the iron entered my soul. After resettling a few miles away to raise his family on the other side of the borderline of emancipated Ohio, Lundy began an anti slavery society and in 1821 moved it to eastern Tennessee, where a manumission society existed. He took over a faltering anti slavery publication, renamed it Genius of Universal Emancipation, and made it the first substantial anti slavery publication in the United States. By 1824, he was publishing in Baltimore and traveling extensively. He wasn't only a propagandist, but also an organizer, helping found other anti slavery societies. He traveled to Haiti in 1825, still 37 years away from being recognized by the United States, to make an arrangement with the Haitian government to take in emancipated people. When in 1826 he arranged for the American Convention for the Abolition of Slavery to be held in Baltimore, there were, directly or indirectly, 81 societies represented, 73 being located in slave-holding states. Lundy began hammering at Woolfolk in print. He reprinted the New York Christian Enquirer's accounts of William Bowser's trial and execution by saying, one woman, Bowser, who was confined to Woolfolk's prison, first cut the throat of her child and then her own, rather than to be carried away. He was carried to the place of execution when a few minutes before his exit he addressed the spectators in a few words, stating his willingness to die and exhorting them to take warning by him to prepare to meet their God. As Woolfolk was present, he particularly addressed his discourse to him, saying that he could forgive him all of the injuries that he had done to him and hoped they might meet in heaven. But this unfeeling soul seller, with a brutality which becomes his business, told him with an oath not to be named that he was now going to have what he deserved, and he was glad of it, or words to this effect. He would have probably continued his abusive language to this unfortunate man had he not been stopped by some of the spectators who were shocked at his unfeeling, profane, and brutal conduct. In a few moments after this, the unfortunate man was launched into eternity. London ended his peroration with the words, hereafter let no man speak of the humanity of Woolfolk. In the South, such an insult against a gentleman would demand satisfaction in a duel. But Woolfolk did not pretend to be a gentleman, nor did he consider Lundy to be one. A few days after the article ran, Lundy was, as he put it in his memoir, assaulted and nearly killed when Woolfolk caught up with him on the street in Baltimore on January 9th, 1827. Woolfolk beat Lundy severely, stomping on his head and leaving his face in a gore of blood. That left him with a long recuperation and permanent damage. According to the coverage in Niles Weekly Register, when Woolfolk was tried for the assault on Lundy, he denied having been in New York during the execution, but admitted that he was guilty of a breach of the law, but in my mitigation of the penalty, They read several articles of the Genius Universal Emancipation, which Lundy acknowledged he had written and published, and in which the domestic slave trade from Maryland to the southern states was spoken of in its heaviest and bitterest terms of denunciation as barbarous, inhuman, and unchristian, and Woolfolk was called a slave trader, soul seller, and so on, and equally guilty in the sight of God with the man who was engaged in the African slave trade. Chief Justice Bryce, in pronouncing sentence, took occasion to observe that he had never seen a case in which the provocation for a battery was greater than the one present. That if abusive language could ever be justification for battery, this was that case. That the traverser had engaged in a trade sanctioned by the laws of Maryland, and that Lundy had no right to reproach him in such abusive language for carrying on a lawful trade. That the trade itself was beneficial to the state. It is removed in great many rogues and vagabonds who were a nuisance to the state. That Lundy had received no more than a merited chastisement for his abuse of the traverser, and but for the strict letter of the law, the court would not fine Woolfolk anything. The court, however, was obliged to fine him something, and they therefore fined him $1 and costs. So this notorious slave trader beat this black publisher, journalist, within an inch of his life, and he was fined $1 and court costs because the judge didn't want him to go to jail, and the judge felt like this was lawful trade, and the judge said that Lundy shouldn't have been writing those bad things about Woolfolk in the first place. Woolfolk won the battle but lost the war. This violent clash of slave trader versus abolitionist was a propaganda victory for the burgeoning anti slavery campaign, which in its early stages tactically consisted largely of attempts to prohibit the interstate slave trade. It was not surprising that Lundy should receive street justice in the hands of a crude man like Woolfolk. Physical threats and intimidation were a regular part of the arsenal of defending slavery. But Lundy's protege, William Lloyd Garrison, had an effrontery to call out the respectable merchant Todd Francis from Garrison's hometown of Newburyport, Massachusetts, in the Genius of Universal Emancipation issue of November 13th, 1829. Todd had allowed his vessel to be used to take 80 or so enslaved people from Herring Bay to Anne Arundel County, Maryland, down to New Orleans at the behest of a Louisiana planter who had purchased an entire plantation's worth of labor. Garrison, who was only beginning his career, was not impressed that, according to Todd's testimony, the whole gang boarded cheerfully at the thought of being transported south to work rather than to be broken up and sold separately. He wrote that Todd should be sentenced to solitary confinement for life. Todd sued him for libel, and Garrison was jailed for his inability to pay approximately $100 in fines and costs after his conviction. Ultimately, he was ransomed by a wealthy abolitionist. From his incarceration, which he was allowed to pass under the conditions more like house arrest, He wrote a letter to Todd, printed in the Boston Carrier, saying, "How could you suffer your noble ship to be freighted with the wretched victims of slavery? Suppose you and your family were seized on execution and sold at public auction. A New Orleans planter buys your children, a Georgian your wife, a South Carolinian yourself. Will one of your townsmen, believing the job to be a profitable one, be blameless for transporting you all wherever you went? Though familiar with all of these afflicting circumstances?" Garrison went on to publish The Liberator, which began on January 1st, 1831, and he formed the New England Anti Slavery Society 1 year later to the day. The most consistently outspoken voice of the movement, The Liberator continued for 35 years, during which it focused on the slave trade of emblematic evils of slavery and as slavery's most vulnerable point. Local and state anti-slavery societies appeared, with the National Anti-Slavery Society being formed in Philadelphia in late 1833. Abolitionism already had a decades-long history in Britain, going back to the days of the Somerset decision. Nicholas Biddle derided its presence in America as part of the latest English fashions of philanthropy and dress. Abolitionism as a much more radical position than merely being anti slavery. One could be anti slavery without actually doing and intending to do anything about it, while barring free blacks from one state and letting the South continue having their slaves. Abolitionists, who were both black and white, and both male and female, wanted slavery to be extinguished immediately where it existed, converted to free labor without compensation to the slave owners. As such, abolitionism was a revolutionary ideology. If implemented, it would have had the effect of impoverishing many of the richest men in the United States, devaluing their capital suddenly to zero. It would destroy the basis of Southern credit. Even John Quincy Adams, who as a congressman delivered up sheaves of abolition petitions to the House of Representatives, wrote in his diary after spending an afternoon with Lundy. Lundy, the abolitionists generally are constantly urging me to indiscreet movements, which would ruin me and weaken and not strengthen their cause. My own family, on the other hand, that is my wife and son and Mary, exercise all the influence they possess to restrain and divert me from all connection with the abolitionists and their cause. Between these adverse impulses, my mind is agitated almost to distraction. The public mind in my own district and state is convulsed between slavery and abolition questions, and I walk on the edge of the precipice in every step that I take. Bona fide abolitionists were relatively few among the white population in the early days of the movement. Though their numbers grew in the 1850s, the hardcore abolitionists were, of course, the enslaved themselves, along with the free people of color who constituted most of the first 500 subscribers of The Liberator. During the summer of 1822, the city of Charleston was convulsed by the investigation of an alleged conspiracy headed by Denmark Vesey, an ex-sailor and free man of color who had confounded Charleston's who had co-founded Charleston's African Methodist Episcopal Church, where he was known as a radical abolitionist preacher. Vesey, whose first name came from his origin, not his birthplace, which is unknown, on the Danish Caribbean island of St. Thomas, came with a suspect background. He had been enslaved in Saint Domingue or Haiti for a time as a boy. In South Carolina, he purchased his freedom from the sea captain Joseph Vesey with lottery winnings in 1799. Vesey was alleged to have organized a plot said to be French influenced to kill white people, supposedly on Bastille Day, and flee to Haiti. Scholars have argued as to whether the conspiracy actually existed. Many now believe it did not, or whether it was only in the imagination of Charleston Mayor James Hamilton Jr., who made a political hay out of it along with Robert J. Turnbull and Robert Y. Hayne, all of whom would in a few years become known as nullifiers. But whether there was a conspiracy or not, the repression of a known revolutionary and the destruction of the African church the AME affiliated with Philadelphia's Mother Bethel was real. 135 men were tried, and Vesey was sentenced to death on June 29th, and was one of 35 who were hanged, becoming a martyr. The AME church was burned by a mob and its ministry exiled. Among the condemned was the African-born Jack Pritchard, or Gullah Jack, a conjurer who was part of the AME congregation and was alleged to have been Vesey's recruiter. African power objects were seen as part of the alleged plot's military process, and as expressed by South Carolina magistrate L.H. Kennedy's reference to the powers of darkness and pronouncing sentencing on Pritchard on July 9th, saying, "In the prosecution of your wicked design, you were not satisfied with resorting to natural and ordinary means, but endeavored to enlist on your behalf all the powers of darkness, and employed for that purpose the most disgusting mummery and superstition. You represented yourself as invulnerable, but that you could neither be taken nor destroyed, and all who fought under your banners would be invincible." When the brig Sally carried 25 sails from the Charleston to Mobile on February 12, 1823, the manifest noted that they were cleared of involvement in the recently attempted insurrection in Charleston. The Vesey conspiracy provoked a series of retaliatory measures that included the formation of a new repressive organization, the South Carolina Association. The Negro Seamen's Act provided for imprisoning free black sailors while their ships were docked in Charleston. So these were free people who went to slave jails because of the job that they had. In open defiance of federal law, it put South Carolina in the provocative position of detaining black British sailors. All emancipation petitions were to be denied. The entry of free people of color into the state was prohibited, as was all education for free or enslaved blacks. A kind of security fence bearing a medieval name became popular in Charleston, the Chateau de Frise. David Walker was probably in Charleston when the post Denmark VC repression began. If VC had a plot, he might have been a part of it. Walker, the first militant African American writer, was born with free status, free mother, enslaved father, probably in Wilmington, North Carolina, though there is no documentation. Probably in 1796 or 1797, and he became literate probably through biblical education in the African Methodist Episcopal Church in Wilmington. When he was grown, he moved to Charleston, where a small community of free blacks worked as craftsmen and entrepreneurs. An evangelical Christian, he probably attended the same AME church as VC and Gullah Jack. He moved on to less repressive Boston in 1825 or 1826, where he married. He kept a used clothes store in Beacon Hill where he sold secondhand sailors' uniforms. He was a subscription agent for the short lived Freedom's Journal, the first African American newspaper, edited by Samuel Cornish and John Rushworth. It was outspokenly abolitionist and anti colonization. In the tradition of that foundational genre of American literature, the insurrectionary pamphlet, Walker published Walker's Appeal in 4 articles together with a preamble to the colored people of the world, but in particular, and very expressly, to those of the United States of America in September 1830. It demanded the immediate overthrow of slavery. Walker's appeal explicitly talked back to Jefferson as the idea of colonization for free people of color, which meant deporting people like David Walker, grew the legacy of Jefferson's philosophical racism in Notes on the State of Virginia was being, in Walker's words, swallowed by millions of whites, adding that unless we refute Mr. Jefferson's arguments respecting us, we will only establish them. But beyond calling for Black responses to Jefferson, Walker's treatise was a call to action for immediate self emancipation, where he said, in the 2 states of Georgia and South Carolina, there are perhaps not much short of 600,000 or 700,000 persons of color. And if I was a gambling character, I would not be afraid to stake down upon the board 5 cents against 10 that there are in the single state of Virginia 500,000 or 600,000 colored persons, 450,000 of whom, let them be well equipped for war, I would put against every white person on the whole continent of America. Why? Why? Because I know that blacks, once they get involved in a war, would rather die than to live. They either kill or be killed. The whites know this too, which make them quake and tremble. Walker smuggled copies of his appeal into the South, where anyone remotely connected with its circulation could be considered guilty of sedition. The first place the appeal turned up was Walker's old hometown of Wilmington, where the North Carolina legislature responded by meeting in a secret session to enact a slew of repressive measures against slaves, but especially against free people of color. By the time Walker was mysteriously found dead on his own doorstep on June 28th, 1830, the state of Georgia had a price on his head: 10,000 alive, 1,000 dead. The rumor spread that he had been poisoned, but no autopsy was done, and no one stepped forward to claim the reward. Walker's appeal was blamed by nervous Southerners for the bloody revolt in Virginia on August 21st, 1831, when at least 57 people were killed in an uprising in Southampton, a few miles north inland from Norfolk. Led by the mystical evangelical preacher Nat Turner and four other enslaved men, the conspiracy had at least 70 followers. Turner was hanged on November 11th, following which his own dead body was skinned and he was consumed. Reaction to Turner's rebellion was swift. Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama all banned out of state traders for a time, though state residents could still bring slaves in and could still sell them. The fear that Turner's collaborators might show up in their territory corresponded to a frequently expressed belief in the Deep South, not entirely unfounded, but certainly exaggerated, that the interstate slave trade was bringing in the dregs of the colored population of the states of the north of us. In the words of a correspondent to a Georgia newspaper, Louisiana's prohibition lasted until 1834, when the immediate terror had passed, so when they weren't scared anymore, and planters would no longer wait. Mississippi's new constitution, to take effect in 1833, included a ban on slaves introduced as merchandise. There was an immediate outcry in Mississippi to lift the ban. Though it remained on the books, it was unenforced. The Mississippi legislature imposed a 2.5% tax on slaves, subsequently reduced it to 1%. Mississippi's flourishing slave trade was thus unconstitutional, but not illegal because they could tax it. And it continued in a gray area until the state again prohibited importations in 1837. In Maryland, where much of the state no longer used slave labor, the reaction to the Turner Uprising was to prohibit almost entirely the growing trend of manumission in 1832. At the same time, Maryland's traffic to Louisiana, which had been drawing down the numbers of enslaved people to the state, stopped. These two reactions, writes Calderhead, practically ended Maryland's chances of eventually becoming a free state. Nat Turner's vision was apocalyptic, but most of the enslaved were more pragmatic. Africans believed they would return home after death. African Americans were home in a high security prison on perpetual lockdown. There was no place for most of the enslaved to escape to, no occupying armies to defect to, as in 1775 and 1814, no foreign held territory in Florida, no Indians left to hide out with. In Virginia, where many whites were already alarmed by having so many black people in their midst, the result of Turner's rebellion was the debate of 1831 to 1832 on the abolition of slavery. The white folks were scared. The only such debate in a Southern legislature ever. Among the many quotable statements of the session was the disapproving declaration by Charlottesville Representative Thomas Jefferson Randolph, grandson of the recently deceased ex-president Thomas Jefferson, who said, "It is a practice and an increasing practice in parts of Virginia to rear slaves for market." Some individual slave owners voluntarily impoverished themselves by freeing their slaves in the wake of the Turner Rebellion. But after considering the matter, Virginia legislators unsurprisingly declined abolition, passing instead a repressive new slave code. So every time they got scared, they came down with more repressive laws. Thomas Dew, a respected academic who subsequently became the president of William and Mary College, published his much read A Review of the Debate in the Virginia Legislature of 1831 and 1832 in Richmond. In it, he argued that ending slavery would reward Turner's violence and legitimize the massacre. John Quincy Adams called Dew's 140-page landmark pro-slavery work a monument of the intellectual perversion produced by the existence of slavery in a free community. A full discussion of Dew's argument, which cites classical biblical and European authors, is beyond the scope of our work here, but we will note two key points. First of all, estimating the annual outflow of slaves into the Deep South market, Dew approvingly spoke of the fecundity of the capitalized womb as an economic engine for the state, affirming that Virginia is, in fact, a Negro raising state for other states. She produces enough for her own supply and 6,000 for sale. Emphasis in original. He was, if anything, conservative in his figure of 6,000 annually exported. Frederick Bancroft believed the number might be more than double that, and some estimates are even higher. And number two, he reported that the post-Turner legislation was actually good for business, with more Louisiana and Mississippi planters journeying up to buy slaves in Virginia in the absence of a mechanism for importing. The Southampton Massacre produced great excitement and apprehension throughout the slaveholding states, and two of them, hitherto the largest purchasers of Virginia slaves, have interdicted their introduction under severe penalties. Many in our state looked forward to an immediate fall in the price of slaves from this cause. And what has been the result? Why, wonderful to relate, Virginia slaves are now higher than they have ever been in many years past. And this rise in price has no doubt been occasioned by the number of Southern purchasers who have visited our state under the belief that Virginia has been frightened into a determination to get clear of their slaves at all events, and from an artificial demand in the slave purchasing states caused by an apprehension on the part of the farmers in those states that the regular supply of slaves would speedily be discontinued by the operation of their non importation regulation. And we are consequently, at this moment, exporting slaves more rapidly through the operation of the internal slave trade than for many years past. Even with Louisiana having closed its markets to outside traders from 1832 to 1834, there were still slaves coming to Louisiana because New Orleans-based traders were still free to import, as per a manifest from September 24th, 1832, which shows the New Orleans trading firm Amédée Gardon at Phil's as owners or shippers of 6 people sent on the schooner Wildcat from Charleston to New Orleans. One tries to imagine the stories behind the names and descriptions by sex, age, height, and skin tone. Willis, Jack, Hector, Adam, Maria, and 7-year-old 3'6" Mary. The business was the business that Dew had enthusiastically described as Negro raising was too important to stop. Meanwhile, Louisiana's cutoff importation combined with the wild Jacksonian credit boom and the new availability of Mississippi land stimulated the slave market in Natchez beyond anything previously experienced. So, as you can see, these people were more interested in slavery than even their own safety. They felt like they could legislate our behavior. They felt like they could write laws that would control slaves. And in some regards, it wasn't their laws, it was the enforcement of those laws that protected them because they had the patty rollers on their sides. They had the National Guard on their side. They had an enforcement arm because you have to remember you can't own what you can't defend, and you can't enforce a law. Doesn't matter unless you can enforce it. So you can't put yourself in a position where you're trying to subject people to laws that can't be enforced because these people unfortunately don't have the authority in place to enforce these laws. And you could see that a generation later, even after his grandfather was dead, Thomas Jefferson's grandson was still holding on to the idea that slavery was a good and necessary and profitable business for a white man. And as you heard earlier, people were getting into this business as young as 18, 19 years old. This was a viable business for entrepreneurs and enterprising young men of the day. Slave breeding and slave trading was how so many families that are wealthy to this very day acquired and accumulated wealth. And we have to be mindful of the fact that this old money that exists in America is slave money. All right, guys, that's all I have for tonight. I know that there are so many people listening. I know that the forecast is listening and Anthony McPhail. Thank you both for being here. I know that Riri is here. I know that Sister Raw and the elders listening with her, whom I'm keeping in my prayers, are listening. I know Bawana Haguziki is listening. Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast is listening. KW Don 7 is listening. Oni Tase from the Pro Black Perspective is listening. D Web from the Harsh Reality Podcast is listening. Cassidra Cheek from the Cassidra Cheek Show is listening. And so many others. I value each and every one of you for listening. And just remember, these people became wealthy off of a system that made us their capital. We were their species, we were their money, we were their means of acquiring wealth. And they're never going to put us in a position where we can play with them on an even playing field. So we have to be the equalizers. We have to be the ones that figure out new and inventive and creative ways to equalize the playing field because they're never going to give it to us. We're going to have to take it. All right, guys, I'll be back on Thursday reading From Niggas to Gods. I will see you then. Thank you so much for listening. Peace.